Minnesota Book Awards is a program of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library and organization's capacity as the Minnesota Center for the Book. This year's Book Awards are sponsored by Education Minnesota and the poetry category through the generosity of Wellington Management. Joining me today are Sue Hwang, author of Bodega, published by Milkweed Editions. Dee Allen, author of A Bony Framework for the Tangible Universe, published by The Operating System. Bok Lee, author of Mitochondrial Night, published by Coffee House Press. And Steve Healey, author of Safe Houses I Have Known, also published by Coffee House Press. I am Chaun Webster, the moderator for this conversation, and about how each of you think about how your work, how does your work live like in the world? Like how outside of the object of the book and how outside of the spaces in which we write it, how does it live in the world? And also maybe, if you could each kind of think about who your work is in conversation with, like both in the sense of like who you see as an audience for the work, but also like who is it that you are kind of like in a continual like conversation with. And I know each of you have, whether that be like references that come up within your work that I could see as maybe like who you might be in conversation with, but I would love to hear from each of you on those things. So we'll open it up like that, and then we'll kind of go from there.
So the first thing that came to mind, and because people are poets here, it's all going to be one major kind of riff session, right? First thing that came to mind is how, and I don't mean to at all make light of the virus, but one thing that came to mind is that when you're working on a book, it begins, for me at least, there's this period, I've only written 3, but I've felt it in each one. There's this period where the book kind of feels like you're interfacing with it physically, almost biologically, neurochemically, and it changes you. Like when you write a book that gets published and it goes out in the world, like you are a changed organism in some way. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but it feels like you hate the book. It's making you stronger. It's making you think about things. It's making your psychological immunity stronger and weaker. It's exasperating you. And I find like poetry it's all about unexpected combinations of things, right? Coming together within a line, within a poem, within a book. And so it feels like the chaos that I'm feeling as just a human being, in the third week or whatever month of the outbreak, let's call it. It's very chaotic, right? No one is quite sure. Everyone I talk to, no one knows what's going on. We don't have enough answers. It's chaotic, but it also feels exactly like when I'm in the middle of a poem, writing a poem and putting together a book. So in some weird way, it feels very familiar.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that myself. I've heard people in the media and friends who have been saying things like, I don't have the attention span to read right now, especially longer works of fiction or nonfiction. And I keep thinking, I don't say this aloud in every instance, but I keep thinking maybe poetry is the literary form for right now, for the crisis. And as you say, the chaos. To me, poetry, one of the beautiful things about poetry and the powerful things about poetry is that it reflects that chaos and crisis that is pretty much in my head all the time. And there's something empowering and healing and just true and real about seeing the chaos and the crisis on the page. So I love that about poetry. It's something that I try to do in my own poetry, and like sort of let that chaos and crisis exist on the page. I think that you know, how I want my poems to live in the world. I want them, and who do I want them to be in conversation with? One of the answers is that I want readers primarily to have a conversation with them. It feels to me like poetry, compared to other literary forms, are allowing that kind of conversation to happen more, rather than being an immersive experience where the outside doesn't come in. For me, when I read poetry, the outside is always blurring with the poem, right? My time and space, my reality is seeping into a poem, and I want to write poems that do that.
Mm-hmm.
And what better opportunity than now? Like, what do we need right now? We need art and literature that allows right now to come into the poem and live in there, and so that we can pause and breathe and say, what the hell is going on right now? Like, what is this chaos? What is this crisis, right? And that's an amazing thing that poetry can do, right? To allow that space and those gaps to happen, so that we can really look around us and say, what's really happening, and what effect is it really happening? What effect is it having on those around us?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Ed, I really liked what you said about psychological immunity. And, you know, something that's been really taken me for a loop about this time and being a poet or, you know, just being a thinker and a maker and a relationer in this time through creative work and through poetry, is for me, you know, my life has been irrevocably altered by illness for the last decade. And I, after grad school, was trying to figure out, you know, I knew that I couldn't really return to the workforce the way that I had been before grad school. And one of the reasons I went to grad school when I did was because I couldn't really, you know, I was like working retail. I couldn't really carry on with that physically. And I love connecting with people and engaging, but teaching is really, really hard on my body and my system, and just kind of in the conventional sense became difficult. And so actually for the past almost 3 years, my life has looked a lot like other people's lives look right now, you know, spending a lot of time at home, working from home, living solo, being self-employed, and kind of trying to keep track of the ways that I can modify and adapt the world around me to not just to work better for me, but because adaptations make everything better for everyone, you know, and access, you know, creating access is better for everybody, regardless of illness or disability. And so that's something I was kind of thinking about with the work is, I don't know. I mean, I like my own copy is all, I don't know what y'all's author copies look like, but mine is all loved and lived with and has bent edges and pressed flowers in it and programs from things that I've participated in since the book came out. And, you know, I think at one point my publisher was asking a similar question to yours, Chaun, about what do you want this book to do in the world? And I was like, I want somebody to plant it in their garden, or like, I want it to be touched and handled and passed along to someone else who needs it. And I don't, I treat many of my books very preciously and carefully, but I also think it's important to have poetry that you can live with and live by and spend time with and drop in the bathtub, because that's the only place where you could read, or whatever. So.
No, thank you.
Yeah, wow. Well, thank you. This is just an honor to be here with all of you. I really like what Ed was saying about how writing a book changes you. And I think for Dee and I, it's our first book. And I am a different person, before this happened. And to think that, I guess through this process, we are developing or creating antibodies also, and changing our sort of cellular selves as poets. And I think why poetry matters right now more than ever is it sort of mirrors the compression that everyone is feeling in their lives. And I think with poetry, it's the compression of language, and it's sort of mirroring kind of what's happening in the world. And it's funny, Sun Young Shin is now my new roommate. She likes to text me even though she's like in the other room. And she texted me an article in the New York Times today, and it's a feature on bodegas. And I think the title is like, Bodegas Now More Than Ever. It just talks about how, these neighborhood stores are even more essential because they, they haven't sort of been plundered by the masses, and they're still kind of serving the immediate community. And so I guess for me, where I want my book to live is sort of in the mundane, in the everyday. I want it to be accessible to every reader. And I see it as sort of like a record of that time of my parents immigrating here and when I was a child. And so I would say that the book is sort of in conversation with my younger self, before I changed through the writing of it. And I wanted to be in conversation with those that haven't had the ability or the time or the permission to write a book, whether through language they were erased or displaced or whatever have you. So yeah, I guess that's kind of where I see the book living. I don't know if I really answered that question, but
No, you really did. No, I really appreciate each of your answers, really, from like how the writing has changed each of you in these various ways to like, I mean, I really appreciate like what you just said, Sue, about like how you're in conversation with your younger self in a way. And I've actually been thinking a lot about Gwendolyn Brooks and how Gwendolyn Brooks writes about how she has this note in Report from Part One where she says actually that she documents how she believes her future self will write, a future Gwendolyn will write. And I'm always like, it's just such a brief, like, it's just almost like you could pass by it, you could read over it and not consider like what work is really maybe happening in what Gwendolyn's writing there. But I think that there is something to like both our past and future selves, right? Like there's something to the ways in which we are becoming. And even when I think about like, how you know, you've responded each to like how you want, like, you know, your work to live in the world. I'm not asking it so much as to think about what your work will do in the world, because I think that we often are asked too much of, particularly poets, in terms of like, you know, something else that our work might do, like, you know, like, and I think I'm personally less interested in what I feel like, you know, each of your work, or any work, is necessarily like doing like in the world, but more so like I'm interested in what it might help become, like, you know, as a part of the world, right? Like, and so and I think that might function differently, like, you know, that might have a different kind of engagement, right? Like, and it might have its own set of, like, you know, merits to it. But yeah, like, I think there is so much about, like, you know, even just the Ellen, like how you were talking about how, like, you know, this sense of like, this is something that I've been quite familiar with, like, for so, you know, for so long. This isn't a strange kind of relationship to space and sociality, like, you know, that so many people in the world are already living the future now, right? That there are so many that are living what I think that so, you know, that, you know, I always kind of consider how, like, you know, there will be a time in which I may not be touched by water insecurity now, in a very visceral way, but like, I don't think that there's a, like, with the direction I see the world heading, I don't know that I will be, you know, able to be sheltered from water insecurity in the ways that I might be sheltered from that now, right? Like that, you know, we see these things all over, like, not just in the distant, you know, other places and other countries, you know, to whom we assume we might associate these things. But yeah, like, I think that there's so many that are having to deal with the future, right? That are having to live with the future. And so what does that, you know, not just foreclose, but what does that also open up, right? Like, like, I think that what you were saying, Dee, about how that the sort of adaptivity, like the adaptations, don't just make, you know, your life better or more possible, but are something that is, you know, making it more possible for everyone, and improving living for everyone. And so yeah, I'm really struck by, you know, those things, like, you know, about how, like, you know, we're not just here, you know, we're not just here in this particular moment. And for some of us have already been here, right? Like, and have already kind of visited, and having to, like, have had to think through this place, you know, that we talk about as this moment. So I don't know where that's headed, and I'm not even necessarily like on to questions, but I'm just kind of thinking about and trying to think with all the wonderful things that y'all are saying. So,
Well, I'll just say a little, you know, my book tries to reckon with my own family history, my own personal crap, my own family trauma. So, and that's a place that poetry has gone a lot, and it's new for me, but it didn't. I kind of knew that I was going in that direction as I was writing the book, but to speak to the future self that you were getting at, and what the book might do in the world. I think one of the things that was most surprising to me is how much I had to reckon with my own privilege in writing this book. Right, this is a book about my own, you know, growing up with a CIA spy father, and it was a messed up childhood as a result. But I also kept coming back to the fact that I grew up as a white male in a suburban middle class environment and everybody looked just like me, right? And I didn't have to feel like an outsider. And that was like a kind of safety net for me. And so one of the things I want this book to, I don't know, to do, I guess, or to model is like, what is it like for a person like me to just like to be thinking about that and to confront it and to reckon with it, and what does that look like for a writer? And then how do I take responsibility as a result, right? Where's my complicity in my father's work, in the history of CIA atrocities, for the last 80 years, And so, like, coming back to this moment right now, and what the wake of all this is going to be like, right? Where is the privilege going to be, and where is the suffering going to be, right? And who's going to take responsibility, and what is that going to look like? Yeah.
Yeah. No. Maybe I'll get into questions, and by way of you kind of opening up, like Stephen, just in terms of talking about your book a little bit, like that. Yeah, like I was definitely like I was feeling a level of like of both curiosity and tension around around approaching your book initially. Was very curious, like both by like the title, as well as like had read the back like with a good friend and like mentor Duck Kearney, like his blurb on your work, and wanted to check it out. But also like with the CIA as a kind of center sort of theme within the book, as well as like a part of your own like life. I was like, oh my God, like where's this gonna go? Because I think both in fictional accounts, as well as like even ones that we might deem historical accounts that like engage with the CIA, there tends to be a level of both embellishments around, as well as omissions of their acts in the world, and so I was very pleasantly surprised actually by your book, and was definitely it was a book that was very gripping and haunting in so many ways,
Thank you.
and so yeah, like I was gonna ask you, and I don't have like any particular order in which I'll be like asking questions, and I'm actually not even looking at like my questions right now, so I might just be riffing with y'all a little bit if you don't mind. But I was wondering, like, in terms of like your own work, as far as safe houses, like I appreciated like the way in which you withheld from us, like as a reader, through the book, that there are ways in which I think you built a particular kind of like narrative that didn't have you held your cards on various parts of things that that made me both curious and wanting more around around the work. And I also think that the form of the book assisted in so much of what it was that you were trying to say, especially like when thinking about the nature of redactions, like in so much of the documents that as a public we come in contact with in terms of like the CIA. So I wonder how you think about both erasure, how you think about form,
Yeah.
absence, as a way to kind of say something, like the substance of absence in your work, you know?
Yeah. Well, I was totally thinking about the history of spy depictions and the Hollywood version of the spy, James Bond. I grew up watching a lot of James Bond movies. And so I became very aware of how glorified and inflated like all of that spy world is. And I realized at some point that I had to rub against that somehow. So I feel like my book is in many ways an attempt to deglorify, is that a word? To deflate, to undermine, to challenge that kind of glorification and show a different version of a spy. You know, my father was a really sort of sad and lost soul in especially in the last few decades of his life. And you know, it's important for me to show the truth about that and how his work really did damage to him as a person. The formal aspect, I did get totally geeked out on form for this book, and I'm not exactly sure why. I use a lot of traditional form, but I often do things with it. I twist it. I loosen it up. I kind of do variations on traditional rules and so forth, and make it my own. But it felt like a way to hold the stories together to some degree, the traditional form. But there is this like I guess a sort of political aspect to it as well, especially as you talk about the erasures and the I also call them well, the redactions, but like sampling poems or poems that are borrowing text from other sources. So there's a whole series of poems in the book that that take archival CIA documents, like CIA training manuals, torture manuals, and so forth, and then sample language from them and then recompose it, or they look like erasures on the page. They look like that on the page. And there's something about like sort of showing like the real factual truth about the CIA and about American history in this kind of documented form, but then take those documents and mess them up, you know, and show the absence, as you say, in them. By creating the absences, the gaps, it felt like I was reclaiming them and critiquing them. It's a form of critique, I think. Rather than just letting them speak for themselves, it's a way of laying a commentary on top of them. And so, you know, there's lots of other ways that form happens in the book, but that's one of the primary ways.
And I wanted to ask Dee about your book as well, because you know, I just, you know, one, I loved it. I think it was a very surprising as well as engaging text that I just I really, really appreciated. But also, you know, I just think that like I think that with the way that you think through the body is something that is so profound. In the way that the book helps, I think, to engage with how to think about like the body through its form is so profound. You know, that that there's not there's a way in which like you do this assembling work that is also a disassembling, you know, and I'm interested in how how you think about form as well. And I think and I mean that more like with regard to the body, like how does your engagement with that help with your kinds of considerations that you've given around the body?
Mm. Thank you so much, Chaun. It means a lot to me. And also I'm just a massive fan of your work and your book too. So good to be here with all of you. Yeah, that's a really good question, and something I've been rethinking about during this time. I started working on this book when I was first officially diagnosed with a connective tissue disorder. And one way that and I think a lot of us poets and artist folk grapple with new and/or difficult or complex information about our lives and our worlds is to think about them metaphorically, and with, the stakes are high, not just objectifying them and setting them aside and looking at them as if we're curious, but also that sort of like, this is a survival tool also. But so that is sort of where I started thinking about connection and disconnection being present in the work. And for me, at first, it was really just, I was writing a lot of narrative poems, a lot of really traditional forms, and this was, like almost a decade ago now. And actually none of the poems from the beginning process of working on a manuscript made it in. Bits of them did, and sort of the emotional tone of them did, but I really needed those for my own process. My body needed those as a sort of initial medicine to heal from that new information that I hadn't fully interpreted or internalized or grappled with yet. And then, I think a lot about, I think a lot of us have been told some version of what I was told in college, studying poetry, or with other writers, which was, a real poet sits at a desk and types or writes at a certain time of day diligently for a certain number of hours, and that's how writing gets done. And if you're writing in your bed, or if you're writing from the bus, or if you're writing, while somebody's tugging at your sleeve asking for something, then it's maybe not as much, you're not as much of a poet. And I think that was intended to like encourage us to have some sort of practice, which I appreciate, but I think the tone of that has, it took a long time for me to dismantle. And so what started to happen was, as my brain and my body changed, and my needs changed physically, my relationships changed, the form of the poems started changing too. And so, I think a lot about, like, especially now for all of us, but, for me, grappling with being a full-time working artist and navigating caring for my body so that I'm still here to make the work is like, I try not to make work anymore that really destroys me in some non-essential healing way. If it's not healing and it's not essential, I'm just not up for it. And I think that what started to happen was, like, there's been a period of time where I couldn't read very much. My brain just like couldn't take in the information. Like a lot of people are saying now, it's hard to read lots of text at a time. And so I started like speaking into a voice recorder and then transcribing those. Or I started making centos, like, bless Ray Gonzalez for teaching me and Sue all about centos in grad school. And, finding scraps of other texts and, like you were saying, Steve, putting them together in ways that made sense for my, that conveyed what I was trying to convey, but I didn't have to pull the language physically out of my own body when I couldn't. And then also, there are poems like long pieces, like my poem Thorn, which also has a series of documentary photographs in it. Like, this poem went through so many changes over the 6 years before the book was published. Like, it started out as sort of like a vertebral column, all left aligned, these really short lines, stanzas, and it went through several other sort of weird shapes before landing in this one. And this one was really like also so that I could easily read it in front of people and not really struggle to sort of follow my own visual structure that I had created. I don't know. And I don't know, just as we were talking earlier about adaptation and access, like Sue used the word accessible, and we're talking about, you know, adapting our lives and our bodies and our spaces right now to what is needed. That was really a huge part of making this book for me too, was, you know, what can I comfortably live inside of? You know, a lot of the parts of the book were really painful to make and to share. I think that's probably true for all of us in some ways. If I, you know, put something in the manuscript, and then every time I went to a reading and read from the rough manuscript before it was an object as a book, and like unconsciously like omitted a line, I was just like, I can't publish that. You know, like if every time I read it, my brain just takes it out, then I'm not ready to have that in the world on a larger scale. So I don't know. Yeah, just listening to those rhythms and letting it be okay. You know, I think sometimes we're really hard on ourselves too about the process. And yeah, so thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, there's a lot to say. Like, and so, so Sue, I think that Bodega is wonderful, and when you're like, you know, mentioning just now, like, you know, the everyday, and earlier mentioning, like, you know, kind of alluding to my my deep love and appreciation for like Gwendolyn Brooks, like a part of like that love is built from my appreciation for poets and their engagement with the everyday and their ability to make those things that we might consider to be mundane or that we might consider to be commonplace, to allow us to like take a kind of helicopter view up from those experiences in the world, and to like to have us think deeply with them, you know. And so, you know, I love that what your work is doing, like in that way. Like I love the 100,000 stories that you are telling in Bodega. You know, that it is so densely populated with story. You know, and I really appreciated that, like about the work, about the sort of the, you know, I think that the way in which it like it could take language also, like not just like everyday experience, but also language that I think that we can the way that you can make me think about certain language newly, right? Like that, like language in which I like, you know, I just think that there's something that's so so lovely about Bodega in that way. So so that's it. Like I wonder also like how, you know, there's so much about place like in your work, and I wonder how like you think about the landscape of Bodega, like you were mentioning earlier, like how, like, you know, bodegas are something that like is now like, you know, there's this appreciation or articulated appreciation for bodegas now, like in they haven't been looted in the same ways that, like, you know, and like the ways in which we think about sort of like crisis oriented consumptions that take place in moments like these, how like I feel like even here actually, like kind of inversely here, along Lowry Avenue, which I live on, right? Like Lowry Avenue has like, you know, the 50% of the businesses along Lowry Avenue are Hmong-owned businesses, right? And so like, you know, some of the Asian food grocery stores, for instance, along Lowry Avenue, like I feel like this was the first time that white folks knew about that might be a place that I can get rice, or like that these are various places that are like actually exist in the world, right? Like that that some of these places kind of like kind of in this moment like are like it's like, oh well, I can't get it at the high V, so where might I now kind of find those sorts of things. But I appreciate like what you said about how like, you know, those spaces are still serving this sort of community function in a direct fashion. um but but again, like I'm wondering, like how do you think about landscape and geography, like in your work? Like how, um, what is like maybe the importance of that for something like Bodega?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think just I've always been really obsessed with place, with my place. As a child of immigrants, you know, we moved around a lot the first few years. We came to the country when I was 8 years old. And so there was this sort of like nomadic element to my life. Even though I didn't really understand what was happening, we were moving around a lot and constantly sort of adjusting myself to a new place. And I think as a way to even just feel safe in my own body, I had to sort of situate myself wherever I was. And I've always been that child that like needed to know where I like, my mom used to always say that I had like an inner compass, because I would always like try to figure out where north was, you know, like where did we just come from? And I think that was just a way to feel safe, but also a way to protect them as well, because I was their main sort of translator. Even as a child, like I picked up English right away.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, just, I think just, and I'm a Libra. So to be relational is sort of hardwired in me. And so I think I've always been really aware of my, with otherness, othering, my, just being an other, and what that means in that in wherever place I happen to be. And with Bodega, you know, I knew I wanted to use that sort of communal urban space to talk about different issues. But there are two, I feel like in the book, there are two landscapes. There's the urban landscape, and there's also sort of this like cosmic landscape that I try to
Mm-hmm.
braid throughout the book. Just because, you know, the urban landscape is what I witnessed as a child, as a person growing up in New York, and then sort of the macro universal lens of where we all sort of fit in as a humanity. And so I think I'm interested in both of those landscapes, I guess, in the book.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know what else to say.
No, I mean you said a lot, and I love it. Like I think the way in which you're also like kind of even in your response juxtaposing like a sort of place as well as placelessness is really important, right? That there is this sense of like you know, I think that we, you know, the sort of considerations of like what home actually is, right? Like is, I think you know, I think that thinking of that as a kind of singular location is not true to so many of us, right? Like are thinking of that as something that is ever fixed is just not it doesn't ring as, you know, true for many folks, you know. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Ed, like, It's my last question, and then and I mean it's so open to like. So I hope that y'all feel free to like engage like beyond like the questions that I'm asking formally. One of the things in particular that I appreciate, and like going back to like what we were talking about in terms of like whether that be like future selves or thinking about like past selves, is the way in which your work does this sort of spatial temporal bending, and the way in which the mitochondria is used as a means to be able to do some of that spatial temporal bending. There are folks that like kind of buck the sort of idea of the individual itself, right? Like that that we are all more than a single being, right? And I think that thinking of the mitochondria, it reacquaints us with that, right? Like it reacquaints us with this notion that that we are thinking and being and living through a long matrilineal line, and that the instance of engaging with like an image of your unborn child might be something that is also connected to this other space and time. I think is really beautiful, especially like when I feel in this moment we have this need to rethink sociality in space and time. Which is not to say that this isn't something that folks haven't already been thinking about and engaging with. And so I suppose there is a question in there, but I suppose like maybe you could be in conversation with me about like what your work is doing with regard to like time and space in particular, and maybe we can just kind of start there.
Yeah, well, I might do things backwards and end up there, because you said so many, I think, really interesting things. And thank you for your time and energy doing this, and for reading and thinking about all our books. The way we're thinking about COVID-19, the virus, I don't think there's any correct or incorrect, but it does seem like we're thinking about it as an invasion, right? Something has invaded our humanity, our humanness. And, I think it's important to remember that this sort of thing has, the idea of an invasive species is very relative and highly subjective. Billions of years ago, a free-form organism, probably a bacterium, entered into a complex cell. They both had their own separate nuclei, and so the nucleuses came together, and somehow within one organism they coexisted. And out of that, billions of years ago, all life as we know it on the planet, plants, animals, every living cell within us has these two types of DNA, the mitochondrial DNA in the mitochondria of our cells, and the nuclear DNA. And to the best of their knowledge, molecular biologists will say that it was not a harmonious relationship at first. It couldn't have been. Just like immigrations, when the Hmong folk you referenced before, started setting up shop, built businesses on Lowry, I'm sure that wasn't completely peaceful and harmonious. I'm sure there were a lot of mixed emotions, right? And I don't at all want to romanticize, the effect of COVID on families, on bodies, on people, because it's bringing death and in many ways economic and other destruction. But I do want to just, I continually have to remind myself that this is part of, what it means, as you said earlier, to be human, things constantly are coming in our bodies and out of our bodies. People, viruses, bacteria, ideas, and it's part of a continuum. I've thought for years and years and years that if there had to be one word, like a one-word poem, for me, it would be time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, within that is hope, loss, a feeling of constraint and restriction, and something that is at once inhibiting your freedom and also giving order and structure to your life so that you can experience freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, I mean, we're all obsessed with time as human beings because we all are going to die and the minutes are ticking away. And yet we all at some intuitive level, I think, know that time is a construct. Time change, when you're sitting in school in 4th grade, 5 minutes left, time lasts forever. That stretches out to feel like, an hour.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're doing other things as an adult, especially the older you get, that 5 minutes feels like, 50 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
It's all very relative, very subjective. And the passage of time in particular, that may be the essential 3-letter or 3-word poem, if I had to write one, that I would write it. Yeah, I don't believe in time. I know it exists. It's just like, I believe in the English language, but I also know there are other languages. Hopi is famously known as for not having a past tense. And so, linguists have studied those who speak languages without past tenses, and they perceive reality in different ways. Culture, time, society, all these things, lexicons, are socially constructed.
Right.
What's on the other side of that, or what's on the other side of the shadow of that? We can see the shadow, but we can't really see or discern what's on the other side of the shadow beyond that. And I think that's where poetry comes in. It's forcing you to, I think, the poetry that I love best, that endures within me, is it forces me to create almost new neural and synaptic connections to be able to perceive what the hell is going on.
Right.
And therefore it's creating a new almost grid, but it's always artificial. It's always a human construction where poetry and humans are concerned, and where social constructed language is concerned. So the best we can do is like create a scaffolding to get to, peer beyond the beyond.
Mm-hmm.
And that scaffolding is always in the same way that we're always creating new lexicons to perceive reality always in quotes.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that's an essential feature of poetry.
Yeah. I've really appreciated everything you've all shared here in this space, and sharing this time with me, and your work and words. Congratulations, each of you, for the finalists, for us being finalists, and I'm looking forward to kind of seeing what happens later this April. So